Hi everyone. Oh, Hi everyone. I'm Dan. I'm the CRO at Vetstoria. You probably know Vetstoria, but in case you don't, it's an automation platform for vet clinics, and we bring solutions like online booking, custom-built websites, chat, and of course payments to over 7,500 clinics worldwide. And today we're here to talk about payments, and we have Joanna Morgan from our partner Global Pay with us. Through a partnership with her company, we offer vet clinics like yours great technology, great security, and of course, great rates on online and offline payments. So e-commerce as well as in-clinic payments. And a key part of all of this is security. And Joanna is here, and she's going to hopefully help us to demystify the payment card industry security protocols, which are often known as PCI DSS. And Joanna joined Global Pay in 2022, and she's responsible for a number of merchant compliance programs here in the UK. Having also spent a lot of time in the industry working on PCI DSS. So hopefully it's going to be a very good conversation and discussion, and hopefully it will be informative for everyone to understand how to keep your clinic compliant and make sure that all of the payments that you're processing are done so in a way that conforms to the card industry's expectations for security. So please do ask questions in the chat if something is uncertain or unclear, and we'll try to get those answered at the end of the discussion. But with no further ado, Joanna, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. So thanks for joining today. The agenda, what I'm trying to do is really pitch this as a real introduction to PCI DSS compliance, because I know it can be rather a significant undertaking for anyone new to the topic. So I'll take you through some of the context that's quite important and the background around it, what those requirements can look like, latest shifts in the industry with the latest version of it, and how we can help, and various resources that are available to you. And as Dan mentioned, we'll open up to Q&A if there's anything that's not clear from the previous slides. But to build upon the introductions, so yes, I joined in July 2022, having spent the last 5 years previously at another global acquirer solely in PCI compliance. And there I had a mixed portfolio across the Europe, Middle Eastern and Asia Pacific regions predominantly, and that included all airlines. And then towards the latter part of my tenure there, I moved into solely managing large level 1 enterprise merchants. So that really resulted in a portfolio that was quite North America heavy at the time. And it's resulted in me having quite a global holistic PCI perspective from an acquirer's perspective. And as mentioned, the remit now encompasses a broader range of merchant compliance programs, such as account data compromise, which can include breaches, and various data integrity programs, high-risk merchant registrations, and general scheme rule violations for the entire UK business. So I thought I'd take you through some fundamentals firstly. So it's often shortened to just PCI, but in full it stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And that's a global standard. So wherever you are in the world, it is the same. And it's made up of 12 principal requirements made up of around 400 controls that are not only technical, but operational too in their nature. So there are 12 main requirements, as listed on the right, mapped to key 6 objectives on the left. I won't go into too much detail over these, as I wanted to keep this quite relatively high level for this particular session. And an annual assessment required against all of these, and that gets documented in a bit of evidence that can get submitted to key business partners and stakeholders. And then underpinning all of those requirements are 3 core elements. That's people, processes, and technology. Now, I find a lot of people do tend to focus on that third point and technology, but that often leads to a lack of appreciation over the importance of those other 2. Because when you delve into some of the requirements themselves, you'll actually note that some of them are more operational. And they touch on things such as security policies, training and education, and contracts as well. So it isn't just that technological piece. So like with many things, it's useful to set some context to understand how it's all come about. So years ago, all the different brands, and when we talk about brands or schemes, that's Visa, MasterCard, Discover, JCB, and American Express, they each had their own separate standards. So it made it really difficult for any merchant or other entity that accepted payment cards to comply. So what those brands did is they came together to create one unified standard to address those interoperability problems in 2004. A couple of years later, in 2006, the independent body that's the SSC, the Security Standards Council. So just as a side note, there'll be a lot of acronyms, and I'll try and define them as we go. And if I use any that are unfamiliar and I haven't defined, please hold me accountable to that. So the Security Standards Council, SSC, they were formed to administer and manage all of those standards and the associated programs that offshoot from those. There's currently over a dozen different standards altogether, and they administer those. They're applicable to people such as ourselves as acquirers, issuers, software vendors. But the major one that I'm going to focus on today is the data security standard specifically. And since its inception, we've had several different iterations, version 2 in 2010, version 3 in 2013. And that's all to address the evolving threat landscape. For the version 4 that we're currently at now was released in 2022, and that was a major, major milestone. And we'll come on to a bit more detail that in a later slide. And then where we are now in version 4 is we have a number of what we call FDRs, future dated requirements, that when we had 2 versions of the standard running concurrently at the same time, there were some future data requirements in there that they said this is best practice for now, but they're going to become mandatory as of the 31st of March. So we're really coming up to the deadline for that. So who does this apply to? Any entity that accepts payment cards is subject to compliance with the PCI DSS, and that includes merchants, processors, acquirers, issuers, and any other service provider in some way, shape, or form. And I get many, many people that say to me, "Oh, I outsource everything. So there's absolutely nothing for me to do." And as an acquirer, we have this constant battle trying to educate against that sentiment when we hear things like, "We don't touch cardholder data. We don't need to do anything. Our web developer told us that the website's compliant. We don't need to worry about it." Or the salesperson at this company says that they sold me this solution and we don't need to bother because it does everything. But there is a common misconception that outsourcing everything, such as using a hosted payment page or web hosting companies, installing point-to-point or P2P devices, eradicates the PCI responsibility altogether. But it's important to remember that being the merchant of record, and that's to say the entity or the company that a cardholder would see on their statement, there's still an obligation on you to be PCI compliant. So you can outsource the activity, but not the overall responsibility. And that's called out in the actual standard itself on page 4. So as mentioned in a previous slide, it is important to remember that it covers people and process as well as the technological piece. We often use the castle analogy. So you can have what you deem to have the most well-built, secure fortress in the entire land, but if no one's manning that drawbridge, there's no processes in place to vet those that keep an eye on the perimeter, then you could open yourself up to a siege. It's important to understand some of the main parties involved. There's various different ones, but I suppose that these are the core ones to be aware of at this stage. So I've mentioned the SSC, the Security Standards Council, who are responsible for development, management, and the administration of the various standards. On top of that, they also validate and list all the approved solutions. So if there's a particular point-to-point encryption solution that you want to deploy to your payment acceptance terminals, you can actually check if it's listed on their website and it's compliant. They've got a really good plethora of information, free guidance and resources. All the templates for all the SAQs, the self-assessment questionnaires are on there. The reports on compliance, that they've got FAQs that come up that are addressable, thousands of them, and there's guides that you can download. It's a really good starting point to really, and also to get under the hood for a number of things. On top of that, they host annual community meetings across 3 global regions, once a year in each one, specifically in Europe. It will be in Amsterdam in October. I'm not quite sure, I can't quite recall. It might be Texas in North America, and I can't quite recall the Asia one this year. But it's a really good opportunity for the overall payment compliance community to come together and discuss the standards and the challenges and the future and what we're seeing on the horizon. On top of that, they also run professional training qualification courses. There's 3 core ones listed on the screen. At the very entry level is PCI Professional or PSIP, PCIP. Then you go to the next level, which is Internal Security Assessor, which is an individual that's qualified to carry out assessments on behalf of their own organisation. And at the very top level is a Qualified Security Assessor, a QSA, who is qualified to undertake assessments against the PCI standards for any organisation in the region in which they are certified. And then moving on to the next one, card brands, schemes, networks. There's a lot of different names they go by. It really depends on sometimes the individual you're talking to or where in the world, how they self-identify. They are responsible for tracking and enforcement of PCI compliance. They can levy penalties or fees or fines and set compliance deadlines. They also define the compliance requirements, such as what we call merchant or service provider levels, and they are, and I'll get onto that later, determined by annual transaction volumes and what the overall expectations of you are for a customer of your size. And then they also approve and list compliant entities. So if you wanted to check that a certain service provider you're using is compliant, then they've got an externally facing website that you can check that and the date by which they achieve compliance. And then moving on to the third column, acquirers such as ourselves, we manage those compliance programs on behalf of those schemes or brands. And based on the transaction volumes that we see in the data available to us, we can then determine what those merchant levels are and then determine what the overall responsibility is for individual merchants. We're responsible for tracking and reporting merchant compliance to the schemes on a regular basis. And on top of that, we run risk management programs to track and report entities with the lower volumes. And we often have products and services to reduce scope, and we have relationships and partnerships with QSA companies and other sort of solution providers that can provide expert assistance or help with scope reduction. And I'll move on to scoping in a moment. And finally, I've already touched upon qualified security assessors, but they are ultimately the gold standard of qualified professionals in this world. They can undertake the scoping of cardholder data environments for the review, perform the assessments on behalf of merchants and service providers and other entities accepting payment cards. We obviously, as an acquirer with quite a significant volume of transaction data flowing through our systems, have to undertake an external audit by QSAs. If there are any points of remediation where they note that there's, oh, you're not quite compliant, or I think you could tie up this with that a little bit more, you could get a little bit more stricter with some of your controls here, what we call remediation, they can assist with that. And once the audit assessment is complete, they'll document those results in what we call validation documents, and they get submitted to an acquirer for the compliance reporting that I've mentioned. So why be compliant? So taking a proactive approach to data security is important for a number of different reasons, but not least because account data compromises or data breaches are incredibly costly events. According to a recent report, the average cost of a breach is $4.88 million US dollars globally, with the UK average sitting just below that at 4.53. Those calculations are based on things such as activity-based costing, and that covers the work involved in detection, escalation, and that will be things like forensic investigation activities, assessment and audit services, things like notification activities, and that will be notifications to data subjects, determining the regulatory requirements and liaising with regulators, the post-breach response, and that'll be formulating that response, dealing with the inbound comms, monitoring the fines from regulators, the legal expenses, and then things such as lost business, reputational harm, and regulatory fines. Of those attacks, 55% were malicious. The remaining had a few more innocent reasons, such as IT failure or human error. And then the average time to identify and contain a breach is around 258 days. And in that, it was difficult to distinguish malicious or legitimate activity. And obviously, the wider the window, the greater opportunity there is, and more cards that are revealed would make it a more expensive data breach as a result. In terms of root causes, compromised credentials and phishing were the two top most common. So it really does demonstrate it's not just the technology that's deployed that needs to be robust here. It really shines a light on the importance of people and processes. So some of you might have seen this hit the news some time ago. Back in 2020, EasyJet were the target of an attack where around 9 million customers' details were compromised. That includes email addresses and travel details that were stolen, as well as cardholder data for over 2,000 customers. We don't have the details of how it happened because that's not been made public, but if they haven't already, the fines and the penalties could be levied from not just the payment brands or the schemes, but also the ICO, the Information and Commissioner's Office, 4% of their turnover in 2019. And that's because we're in that GDPR space now. Revolut, I think, we're another example. of the people and processes piece, they fell victim to social engineering methods to gain access to their database. And a popular tactic that we do see in other recent attacks in well-known companies is persuading an employee to hand over sensitive data, such as their password. You hear about stories about criminal gangs approaching call center employees, after they finish their shift, for instance. So how to avoid this? Being obviously PCI compliant is one huge step in mitigating that, and you do that by doing an audit of your cardholder data environment, what we call your CDE. And the first step in that process is to accurately determine the scope of that review. That means identifying all locations and flows of account data and identifying all systems that are connected to, or if compromised, could impact that CDE. Once you've determined that scope, you're then expected to retain documentation to demonstrate how that was determined. So effectively showing you're working, and that's reviewed by your assessor, whether that's an internal assessor or an external QSA for validation. The bigger that scope, the more complex your assessment, as more PCI controls need to be in place to secure that environment. So that can mean a costlier assessment and more resources required to maintain that number of PCI controls on a continuous basis. Scope can be reduced using methods such as secure tech, such as point-to-point encryption solutions and tokenization solutions. That can also include things such as isolating the CD from the rest of your network by putting in things such as physical or logical methods, like internal network security controls, routers with a strong access control list, or other technologies that effectively restrict access to that particular segment of the network. But to be considered out of scope, a system component must be properly isolated so that even if that out of scope component was compromised, it wouldn't impact that CDE. Once you've determined that scope, you'll have a clear picture top down of what exactly you need to assess. And in preparing for that assessment process, you need to start gathering as much information in advance as possible. Front loading is a huge recommendation. It just means you're not doing so much back and forth towards the end of it. The more you've got documented to show you're working, show you're compliant in adherence to these controls, the easier your assessment process will be. And that'll be gathering things like your security policies, change control records, network diagrams, scan reports if you're running them, system documentation, training records. And obviously, to facilitate the provision of all that information, you need to stand up appropriate resource. So you might need participation from senior management, project managers, and stakeholders from IT, HR, and legal, because where we do see merchants fail is where it sort of falls to one individual just to fill out a form. And you can imagine someone in IT doesn't have access to HR training records, and someone in HR doesn't have access to network diagrams, for instance, conversely. So it's important that it doesn't fall to one individual, and the better prepared you are by standing up appropriate resource and gathering all that information, the easier that process will be. As part of the assessment, that will then involve reviewing each of those PCI controls that are applicable to your environment and undertaking the necessary testing against each control. And that's to confirm that that control is being met. So testing can include a critical examination of data evidence like audit logs and data files, observations, so watching personnel perform a task or a process or system component doing a function, and undertaking interviews with staff, so to confirm if an activity is being performed, getting them to describe how they're doing it and test their knowledge and understanding. Sometimes there might be a legitimate constraint in meeting a particular requirement, so sometimes things such as compensating controls are put in place to sufficiently mitigate against the associated risk. But after testing, the assessor will proceed to then mark each requirement as compliant, non-compliant, not applicable, not tested, or in place with a compensating control worksheet. And that's wrapped up in validation documents that detail the results. These then get submitted to the acquirer for review, and if we as an acquirer are satisfied with the content, that it covers everything that we'd expect it to, whilst we're not here to be definitive as to whether you have determined something is or isn't in scope, sometimes that part of that due diligence that we undertake is like, we've noticed that you're taking some card present transactions, but this document only seems to reference your e-commerce. Where's the rest of it? So once we're satisfied that we've got everything we need to do so to satisfy the payment brands, then and that we don't have any follow-up questions, we'll report you as compliant to the payment brands for the 12 months after for the duration that the documents are valid for. So they are, once you've completed the assessment, they get dated and submitted, and it's 12 months that they're valid for. So in terms of the documentation specifically, These are largely guided by your PCI level. I mentioned earlier about PCI levels. These are thresholds of annual transaction volumes determined, that's set by the payment brand, determined by those volumes that then set out the documentation that you need to complete. So as you can see at the top left, excuse me, so level ones, over 6 million Visa or MasterCard transactions annually. And when I say or, we don't push the volumes together. It's a first past the post system. So if you hit the threshold with Visa, you're also at a level one with MasterCard. They tend to piggyback onto what Visa do, because in our region, we do tend to see Visa as the more prevalent payment brand. Level two is between 1 and 6 million transactions annually. And then level 3 and level 4 is anything under 1 million. And the key differentiator is the e-commerce volumes for level 3s to put you in that segment. But ultimately for 3 and 4s, the requirements are exactly the same. And in recent weeks, Visa have merged the two levels for that very reason. I think MasterCard still treat them separately, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do the same, because they tend to follow suit. Level ones are held to that highest of standards, because with great power comes great responsibility, and they are mandated to use a QSA or an internal security assessor, and they're mandated to submit a report on compliance. And that's effectively quite a meaty report that has all 400 odd controls contained in it. They're all marked as compliant, not applicable, etc. With a supplementary summary called an attestation of compliance that gets signed off by the QSA or ISA. I do mention scans on here as well, but that's only if they're applicable to the environment as determined by the scoping exercise. As I said, that with that number of transactions, that it's mandated to use a QSA. With level 3 and level 4s, they're allowed to self-assess via what we call an SAQ, a self-assessment questionnaire, but that doesn't mean that they can't go out and get the expertise of a QSA and have the belt and braces of approach. It's we do see that for the belt and braces, as I said, and well, it's particularly where they lack that expertise in house, so to speak, or organisations that don't have that mature security posture. Level 2s, so as I said, were the ones between 1 and 6 million. It's a little bit of a grey space, because it really does depend on your scope for that one. So you might be able to completely self-assess without an ISA or QSA. You might be able to you might have to get that additional level of expertise. It really does depend. Typically, if you're processing e-commerce transactions, as I said, the external vulnerability scanning, if that's applicable to the environment, and those get submitted quarterly. And like with QSAs or ISAs, an ASV is an approved scanning vendor, approved by the Security Standards Council to carry out scanning services under Requirement 11. So I'll move into the SAQ specifically. These are validation tools for self-assessing entities to perform and report the results of their self-assessment. And there are various different ones available. SAQ-D on the right contains all of the requirements of the standard, similar to a report on compliance. So if you're storing cardholder data, if you don't fit any of the other criteria for the other SAQs, you'd have to do an SAQ-D. And a lot of people try to avoid that, because there's obviously a lot to consider. When you do look at some of the requirements, though, you might actually think that's really superfluous for our environment. And luckily, the SSC developed a series of other SAQs that are each a different subset of the standard, designed for common payment environments, essentially like a pick and mix. So when you think about fully outsourced, card not present merchants with a wholly outsourced environment, SAQA, and that really reduces the number of requirements down from 400 or so down to around 35, 40. And similarly with the SAQ P2PE, card present merchants using a point-to-point encrypted solution, similar there. And you've got the new one now under version 4. See the next to SAQ-D there, it's the SAQ SPOC, which stands for a software-based PIN entry on a commercial off-the-shelf device. So essentially like a smartphone or tablet. So those are the smaller SAQs that we tend to see a lot of people aim for by deploying the technology that allows them to reduce that scope. Now, a word of warning, as an acquirer, we always get asked, just tell me what SAQ to do and I'll do it. So aside from the fact that an SAQ is supposed to be the output of an annual assessment and not just some tick box exercise annually, ultimately the clue's in the name. It's a self-assessment. So if a merchant can't determine their own scope, they should look to utilise the expertise of a QSA, which acquirers are not, as you mentioned, as I said on the earlier slide, with the different parties. And yes, though merchants might be using some of our solutions and products that can help reduce scope, but they still need to be mindful of how those are implemented, monitored, and so on under the people and processes side of things. When it comes to ask for confirmation on which SAQ to do, we often use another analogy. You wouldn't ask the GP receptionist to tell you what medication you need, for instance. You'd go to the expert to source. But a better way of putting it is to consider the scenario of a sole trader completing their tax return to HMRC. The government might have guidance and toolkits and all available to assist with the self-assessment process, as well as a team for general inquiries, but ultimately they don't do that assessment for that sole trader. The recommendation from them is to seek an accredited accountant to perform it on the trader's behalf. So think of the acquirer as HMRC in this scenario and the QSA as the accountant. And we find that analogy tends to work. It makes that subject a little bit more relatable, but it's a conversation we do have quite frequently. And as I mentioned earlier on in the session about, you do have a lot of people in the market selling solutions or uneducated to, be providing that level of advice that really leads to this underappreciation of responsibilities. And I'd really listen to the acquirers who are running these programs day in, day out, as opposed to people that aren't doing this day in, day out, because it's ultimately to protect your business. We're not doing it to police you, we're doing it to make sure that everyone's compliant and cardholder data is held securely. So we've hit a major milestone in the industry with the release of version 4 of the PCI DSS. It was really driven by significant feedback from the industry, with more than 6,000 items of feedback that were received across 3 different requests for comment processes from more than 200 companies globally. And that aims to continue meeting the needs of the industry by promoting security as a continuous process. We often find that there's this just one and done type attitude to it, when actually being PCI compliant, and I'll use another analogy, it's not like having your MOT done and you've got your, or think of it like you're having your MOT, just because you've passed it one day doesn't necessarily mean it's roadworthy a month down the line once you've hit a pothole. So it's really to address that BAU type things. There's things in the standard that say that there's a quarterly cadence for checking certain things and other regular checks that need to be carried out. And then the assessment process is just the annual portion. So it's aimed to addressing new risks identified with the introduction of new requirements, such as expanding Requirement 7 specifically to incorporate multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all access to the cardholder data environment, implementing phishing prevention technologies, which is particularly important when you consider that was one of the top 2 reasons for data breaches previously, monitoring e-commerce sites for scripts changes, which is a big topic at the moment. And I know there's quite a lot of confusion around that at the moment, that the industry is really trying to rally around and wrap their heads around and define. And I'm sure there'll be some more communicated in due course around that. And then clearly assigning roles and responsibilities for individuals that work against each requirement. And again, not for it all to land on one person. Another key call out was the addition of external vulnerability scanning for SAQA merchants. And some of, as I've mentioned previously, some of these are future dated requirements, but only for now another couple of weeks, because they will become mandatory. Version 4 also increased the flexibility for more mature organisations. And when I say more mature, it is those ones that, these huge companies that have got huge security teams, they're using a qualified security assessor, real mature programs stood up around that. They may opt to use what's called the customised approach compared to what we call the traditional defined approach that was very black and white. The customised approach was developed in response to the industry wanting a lot more flexibility to use innovative technologies to achieve security objectives that often don't fit with that neatly defined approach for implementing and validating PCI. So how can we help? Firstly, we have a suite of products that can help reduce scope, as mentioned, such as our validated and improved point-to-point encryption solution, as well as our hosted payment page or hosted payment fields for e-commerce payments and a virtual terminal solution. And then we also have relationships with trusted third parties and qualified security assessors. When it comes to compliance validation and management, we've made things easy for self-assessing merchants. So all of our level 3 and 4 merchants who have access to security metrics and the program that we call Global Fortress. They are a leading QSA company and they're available 24/7 all year round for our enrolled merchants. And what will happen is a representative from Security Metrics will ask all the necessary profiling and scoping questions to help determine the SAQ that would be most applicable to the environment based on the information supplied. And merchants can either complete that validation over the phone with that representative or log into a web-based portal and go through the process in any time. And then they do best endeavours to send reminders to send out in advance of compliance expiring, or if there's a deadline coming up, you need to do this by this date, or this is going to happen. That will be sent by email. They also do, as I said, best endeavours to reach out by telephone if that information has been supplied to them, just to make sure that merchants do revalidate on time. They're also an ASV company, an approved scanning vendor. So if that scanning, external vulnerability scanning is applicable as determined by the scoping exercise, they can actually perform this for you without having to source a separate vendor altogether. It's wrapped up in the service if need be. On top of this, they've got a suite of other product or service offerings to assist, such as PanScan, and that's a tool that helps you determine that you're not inadvertently storing cardholder data that could open you up to additional risk if not protected. Shopping Cart Inspect, which is a non-intrusive manual inspection of your e-commerce website shopping cart by a forensic investigator, and that will determine if your website's fallen victim to JavaScript skimming. That's a big one. As I've mentioned, we've got that new e-skimming requirement under version 4. So it's quite a useful tool that they offer to our merchants. They will produce a report that illustrates a risk rating as well as a prioritised list of vulnerabilities, description of malicious JavaScript. They identify the suspicious URLs on the website, a list of third-party domains that are participating in your e-commerce experience, remediation recommendations if there are any, and any techniques, as well as 24/7 technical support to remediate. And then you have policies. As I've mentioned, there's a big part of PCI, and they've got a number of customizable security policy templates. They can also deliver training. And of course, as a QSA company, they can actually perform the actual PCI assessments on behalf of a merchant. And that'll be either an assisted self-assessment questionnaire or a full report on compliance. That can be done on site or remotely, which was something we saw happen quite significantly. There's a big uptick with remote assessments, obviously, during COVID, when the pandemic's happening globally. Security Metrics being a company based in Utah in the United States, it means you can undertake that assessment from anywhere in the world ultimately. But they, and we do have partners elsewhere more locally as well if on-site is important to you. I've also included some key contacts. So for our global payments acquired merchants, we've got a number of different avenues to assist. We've got our help desk, the enrolment details for Global Fortress run by Security Metrics, our payment PCI team, as well as the Security Metrics PCI support team that are available 24/7. And links to more resources I've included as well. So there's obviously the merchant levels that that will determine what you need to be doing on an annual basis, what documentation that you need to complete based on that level. Included lists, the listings for the externally facing service provider list. So if you wanted to check that, Global Payments has an attestation of compliance, I believe ours was dated some point in November 24, which is valid till November 25. The Security Standards Council SSC, which is mentioned, is the really good haven of information. The document library, which is where you can actually download the standards themselves, the SAQ templates, and all the program information. And on that point about the standards themselves and the SAQ templates, it's important to note the SAQs will only state the requirement and a box for you to tick as to the answer that you're giving. But when you actually download the standard itself, it actually gives you the recommended testing against each PCI control, and then some best practices in another column. So it's quite handy having both documents there to cross-reference. I think the reason why it's not included in the SAQ is not to overwhelm the document with all that information that make it, you can look at it and you think, oh, there's 400 pages there. I'm not reading all of that. So it might be just worth cross-checking with the SAQ, particularly if you've got one that's reduced from 400 controls to say 35, 40, like an SAQA. It's just cross-checking, why these requirements are important for that environment and what the context around it, why it was put in place, and some of the recommended testing for you to check your adherence against it. And then I've added the landing page for our Global Fortress product as well for any merchants that do require access to that and are interested in enrolling. I think with that, I can open up to Q&A.
Thanks, Joanna. To everybody on the call, if you do have questions, you can pop them into the chat or the Q&A session that's in the bottom tray. Just to say, most people on this call, unless you're part of a larger group, will be a tier 4 merchant, and therefore the self-assessment questionnaire that you'll need to complete in order to become PCI compliant will hopefully be one of those softer ones that Joanna referred to. Hopefully not having 350 protocols, but maybe 35 or something along those lines. We all for sure on the call are taking in-person, face-to-face payments. Some of us may be taking payments over the phone via a Moto terminal. And there's a growing group that are taking e-commerce payments either via a solution like Vetstoria or through a Shopify or another account, which will allow for e-commerce transactions on a website. So yeah, just curious to know if there are any questions on the topic from the floor. I'll ask one. Joanna, obviously, self-assessment is a very important thing to do in order to be able to, keep hold of cardholder data, avoid a data breach that might negatively affect the reputation of your organization. If you're a merchant that's in the fourth group, so the smallest of the four, you're doing maybe 10, 15,000 transactions, per year, all almost exclusively all in face-to-face fashion. Is there an estimate how long doing a self-assessment questionnaire will take? Is it something that's going to take a couple of hours, couple of days? I don't know if there's a rule of thumb or a benchmark that we could, let people know about.
It's hard to put a figure on these things, because some people say it's going to take me 5 minutes because they do look at it like a tick box exercise. But if you're doing it properly, it's really how long a piece of string is, because how have you determined your scope? What documents have you already got to hand that you can evidence? If you've done all that prep work in advance, and the assessment process is relatively straightforward. So I'd really recommend doing all the preliminary work involved before obviously proceeding to the straight to an SAQ, because when you look at them, you think, well, if I were to suffer a data breach and the schemes mandate a forensic investigator, we've reported that merchant as compliant because they filled out an SAQ, because we were acting in good faith here that that's representative of an assessment. In the event of a breach, obviously penalties are issued, but you can get a discount to these penalties if you're found to be compliant or you were reported correctly. And if actually there was someone being a little bit more liberal with the truth, which sometimes we can be if we're self-assessing, we can be a little bit more generous to ourselves, because you think, well, I've seen that happen, or I'm pretty sure we've got that policy, I'll mark it as compliant. But then as an external auditor, that your license is on the line and you want to make sure things are done correctly, I'm not signing off until I've seen that policy. So conversely, when that forensic investigator comes in and says, well, actually, you weren't able to evidence that, so you're not compliant, you might not then receive the benefit of a fine reduction. So back to your point about the timings, it is largely dependent by the size, not necessarily to do with the number of transactions, because that really is only really applicable when it comes to determining risk and the validation requirements. How many stores are you looking at, and how many employees have you got, and how many people around you helping you, assisting with the actual assessment process, or is it all landing on one person's shoulders? Where I've seen, I would say there's an average time frame from an enterprise space, from the point at which and this is obviously from a larger merchant perspective, it's harder to determine with self-assessments because we don't have that level of detail reported to us. But a report on compliance completed by a QSA states when the dates they arrived on site or started the assessment, the date the assessment ended, and the date of when the report was completed. So it's easy to sort of determine that, and probably around 3 months on average. But again, you're talking about a very different story. When you've got a very complex environment, some merchants have flat networks, for instance. There's a lot more in scope to consider, whereas you might still have a very large entity that's largely outsourced. So really, they might just be taking a sample of, think about your Tesco's of the world. They're not going around to every single Tesco checking what's going on. You're taking a representative sample, but I'd say the average for a compliant entity where there's not any remediation required, around 3 months. A very long-winded way of saying how long is a piece of string.
Yeah, fair enough. I knew that might be the answer, but just was curious to know if there was a data point or two that we could use. But it does sound like if you have your people and processes in place, and you feel confident that people are acting appropriately, going through the self-assessment questionnaire should not be a very long process. The issue will be if people and processes are not in place, are not aware that you can't, for instance, take a card payment over the phone. If it's done through a standard chip and PIN terminal, it needs to be done through a Moto terminal. These kind of standard protocols, if they're in place, completing the self-assessment questionnaire shouldn't be terribly long of a process. But yeah, you need to make sure that you have the right checks and balances in place from day one.
Agreed, yeah. I think when you've done all that preliminary work and once you've achieved compliance the first time, because security is that continuous process, right? When it gets to the assessment process, if you're using, say, our Global Fortress service, and as I said, you can just call up security metrics and complete it over the phone. That's not a lengthy conversation. It's like, have you got this? Have you got that? Because it's all done on you affirming that in a positive way. Yes, we have got that. It's just being able to show that working if anyone comes asking for it, such as a forensic investigator, which you would hope you would not need if you were compliant all along, because you wouldn't suffer that data breach. So the actual self-assessment process should be relatively easy if you've got all that groundwork laid. And secondly, I suppose even before that point, if you're using secure solutions, it really takes the lion's share of the requirements out and really leaves your people and processes to consider.
Makes sense. Super. I don't think there's any questions that have come through from the audience. If there's any that anyone would like to bring up, I think now is the time. And if not, I think we can wrap up. Joanna, thanks very much for your time here. I think it's been a very informative discussion. I think it's a topic that people don't know too much about and maybe get a little bit nervous about. And if they, do work with a company like Security Metrics and Global Pay, I think they'll probably feel a little bit more easy about all of this. It's an important topic and one that feels hard to understand, but if you have an expert on your side, hopefully you can get familiar with it and get comfortable with it, and most importantly, be compliant. So unless there's any other questions, Joanna, thank you very much for your time, and audience, thank you very much as well. And we can wrap it up there.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Super.